Good afternoon. My name is Ayaz Pervez. I'm from the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery at the World Bank, and I'll be moderating today's session on assessing recovery needs in complex crises. So, unfortunately, one of our speakers is not here physically, but I'll request our colleague, other colleague, Rita Missel from UNDP to kindly join me on the stage so that I'm not so alone. Thank you, Rita. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the post-disaster needs assessments and recovery and peace building assessments, which are conducted by countries with the support of the EU, the UN, the World Bank, and other agencies. So today's session is particularly going to focus on how do we conduct post-disaster assessments, which are challenging itself, quite a task, but to do them under fragility, conflict-affected settings is quite another ask. So we have a lot of experienced speakers today who will be speaking about the challenges, the good practices, and the innovations that are required to conduct post-disaster needs assessments in fragility settings, in complex crises. We will have a couple of case study examples. Hopefully, our Zimbabwe speaker, Mr. Nathan, will show up soon. But otherwise, we'll have to proceed without that. So, one of the challenges that we've been facing has been how to, make PDNAs or post-disaster assessments conflict sensitive. And so that's a subject that we'll be dwelling on in detail. How can they address the structural drivers of conflict and crisis, and so on and so forth. We have done a few successes, and I'll be talking about it periodically, but we will learn more from the experience of the speakers. So the session's objectives are to really review the current assessment approaches, including conflict-sensitive PDNAs and RPBAs, clarify the roles that recovery assessments should play, including towards not just disaster recovery but also peace building. Review experience with recent hybrid experience, particularly we have experience with we have some experiences of how to conduct post-disaster needs assessment while employing some principles of RPBAs or recovery and peace building assessments. So we'll have colleagues talking about that a little bit, and then maybe we can hear some recommendations from the speakers on how to improve recovery assessment in these complex interconnected events. So let me just quickly, with that, go through the speakers upfront, because I know we are all running a bit late and we have the closing ceremony. I'll just quickly, in one go, introduce all of the speakers. And we'll start with a video presentation from El Salvador, and Mr. Miguel Catan, Secretary Commerce and Investments, will be making a presentation together with his colleague, Jason Posoda. Mr. Miguel Catan is quite an entrepreneur, a specialist in strategic business management. He's the current Secretary Commerce and Investments in El Salvador. So he will be making this presentation, and I'll not go through the details of his other details. And second, he will be joined in the video by Mr. Gerson Posoda, who's currently the Deputy Secretary at the Ministry of Finance in El Salvador. And he has worked in the Ministry of Finance since 2001, serving as the head of the Department of the Strategic Debt Management and so on and so forth. And he holds a bachelor's degree in Business Administration and a master's degree in Finance. So these two gentlemen will be making the presentation, and we might have some online presence from El Salvador through some of their representatives. Next up, we'll have my own very colleague, Joy Oyon, who's joining us at this very odd hours in DC. She's a disaster risk management specialist in the World Bank's MENA region, the Middle East and North Africa. She co-led the assessment that was carried out in the context of the Beirut explosions, the RDNA, which led to a recovery framework and subsequent investments in trust funds. So Ms. Joy will be speaking a little bit about the experience of the rapid damage and needs assessment, or RDNA. Her portfolio, she has done many interesting assessments, so maybe if she has an opportunity, she can speak about the rapid assessments we have carried out using these hybrid techniques in Iraq, Syria, and in Lebanon, and in Yemen and Libya. Next up, I hope that we will have Mr. Nathan Nakoma, who's the Chief Director of Civil Protection from Zimbabwe. He's here in physically at the conference, but somehow he is not currently in the session. So we are contacting him, and hopefully he will join. Otherwise, we'll have to probably skip that part of the presentation. I apologize for that. And then we have Mr. Thomas Hookley, or Tom Hookley, who is team leader of the EU's Foreign Policy Instrument Project. He's a consultant, and he supports recovery, post-crisis recovery assessments and recovery planning. He's a colleague of many years, and we'll really benefit from his experience today. He's connecting online just like Joy, and he primarily focuses on conflict-related crises, and he has supported many assessments, including in Cameroon, CAR, Nigeria, Mozambique, Palestine, and Ukraine, and so on and so forth. And finally, we have Ms. Rita Missel, our own colleague from UNDP, with whom I have had the pleasure of working very closely for many years. Rita is the Global Recovery Advisor for the United Nations Development Program's Crisis Bureau. It's based in New York, and she's a practitioner par excellence, in my view, with over 20 years of experience in disaster recovery, and particularly on assessments. And I think most of you know Rita. She needs no more further introduction. So that's generally the session. We will have a quick Q&A from the floor after the session. And so with that, I'll request to maybe start the presentation. We have a video presentation from El Salvador. The subtitles are available in English, so I'll actually be relying on the subtitles myself. So can we please play the video from El Salvador, please? Thank you.
Escuchamos por El Salvador al secretario de Comercio e Inversiones, Jorge Miguel Catán. Y luego, como segundo punto, escuchamos siempre por El Salvador al viceministro de Hacienda, Gerson Rogelio Posada.
El Salvador agradece la invitación a participar en el Congreso Mundial de Reconstrucción en conjunto con la Plataforma Global de Riesgo de Desastres liderada por la Oficina de Naciones Unidas para la Reducción del Riesgo de Desastres. En el año 2020, como gobierno de El Salvador, enfrentamos los efectos de las tormentas tropicales Amanda y Cristóbal y la emergencia por COVID-19. Tomamos la decisión de hacer una evaluación de necesidades post-desastre, nunca antes hecha en nuestro país, para conocer la cuantificación de daños de estos eventos combinados, sus impactos económicos y sociales, y estimar los costos de recuperación del país, utilizando para esto la metodología de evaluación de necesidades post-desastre. Por el gobierno de El Salvador, la evaluación fue liderada por la Secretaría de Comercio e Inversiones de la Presidencia de la República y el Ministerio de Economía, apoyado por un equipo integrado por 23 instituciones del gobierno que pertenecen a los diversos sectores evaluados. La evaluación fue conducida por un equipo del Sistema de Naciones Unidas con el PNUD, así como con un conjunto de expertos de la Unión Europea y el Banco Mundial. Todo esto conllevó un esfuerzo muy grande, debido a que por la pandemia del COVID-19, todas las capacitaciones debieron de realizarse de manera virtual. En el marco temporal en el que se realiza el análisis fue a mediados de marzo del año 2020. Fue un año difícil para El Salvador con la pandemia que afectó al mundo entero y que comenzó en marzo, y las tormentas Amanda y Cristóbal que azotaron entre mayo y junio. En el caso de la pandemia, las necesidades estimadas derivan de los efectos que las medidas de confinamiento y contención para el manejo de la pandemia requirieron hasta mayo del 2020. La pérdida de ingresos, el aumento de costos para asegurar la provisión de servicios sectoriales y los costos inesperados que debieron erogarse para responder a la pandemia. Estas necesidades se incrementaron con la llegada de las tormentas tropicales, que añadieron un panorama de destrucción de infraestructura y activos físicos y aumentaron las pérdidas económicas en diversos sectores. Los mayores daños en el caso de las tormentas se concentraron en los sectores de vivienda y transporte, mientras que por la pandemia las mayores pérdidas fueron en sectores productivos de industria, comercio, turismo y servicios, en vista de que no hay destrucción ni parcial ni total en los activos físicos. Las necesidades de recuperación estimadas sumaron arriba de los 1.200 millones de dólares, concentrados en su mayoría al sector social, particularmente educación. Como resultado del análisis se establecieron 5 líneas estratégicas para la recuperación: gobernabilidad, recuperación económica, reducción del riesgo en infraestructura resiliente y vivienda digna, tecnología e innovación, bienestar y protección e inclusión social. Después de la evaluación, El Salvador hizo una revisión de su política y operatividad para la evaluación y recuperación post-desastre. articulando los esfuerzos de diversas instituciones del Estado y socios estratégicos como PNUD, Banco Mundial y Unión Europea, así como otros socios cooperantes. El gobierno de El Salvador solicitó al PNUD apoyo para preparar adaptaciones de la metodología PDNA a sectores específicos, a fin de tener una estandarización e institucionalización de cómo llevar a cabo las evaluaciones ante la ocurrencia de eventos que el país declara como desastre, fortaleciendo las capacidades locales, facilitando el proceso de integración de información entre sectores y manteniendo la coherencia de la metodología estándar. Actualmente se cuenta con 8 guías adaptadas a los sectores productivos, agricultura, ganadería, pesca y forestal, y sociales, vivienda, educación y salud, de infraestructura, transporte, energía y agua, así como de saneamiento. En 2022 se ha trabajado en la adaptación del marco de recuperación post-desastre, partiendo del marco de recuperación internacional desarrollado por Naciones Unidas, Banco Mundial y Unión Europea bajo el acuerdo tripartito. El marco de recuperación para El Salvador establece un marco claro y definido para eventos futuros con la flexibilidad institucional y operativa que los desastres futuros requieran, adaptando con base a la experiencia nacional e internacional, institucionalidad existente y prioridades establecidas por el gobierno de El Salvador. El marco permitirá al gobierno estar en una mejor posición para dirigir procesos de recuperación integral, considerando las dimensiones física, social y económica, garantizando mecanismos de financiamiento adecuados y unificando los esfuerzos de todos los socios para el desarrollo. El marco de recuperación se plantea con la visión de implementar una recuperación resiliente en El Salvador, a través de la recuperación y mejora de la infraestructura, los servicios, los medios de sustento y condiciones de vida de la población afectada por el desastre, reduciendo los factores de riesgo, generando co-beneficios, promoviendo el desarrollo sostenible y construyendo una sociedad más equitativa. Reconocemos que los desastres implican incrementos en el gasto público y requieren en la mayoría de casos reasignación de presupuestos gubernamentales y la búsqueda de ingresos suplementarios. Al mismo tiempo pueden reducir los ingresos del gobierno porque alteran la actividad económica. Los efectos incluyen reducción de la productividad, inflación creciente, reducción en el poder de adquisición, comercio o importaciones y exportaciones. La recuperación post-desastre requiere mecanismos e instrumentos financieros adecuados, cuantificación rápida de costos, presupuestos de recuperación, identificación de fuentes de financiamiento y establecimiento de mecanismos para la administración y seguimiento de los fondos. La adecuada gestión financiera ante el riesgo de desastre es esencial. En 2021 se elaboró con apoyo del Banco Mundial la Estrategia de Gestión Financiera ante el Riesgo de Desastre, la cual tiene como misión velar por la estabilidad, sostenibilidad fiscal a través de una gestión integral de los riesgos fiscales asociados, principalmente a los desastres. La estrategia ha permitido, por un lado, establecer mecanismos e instrumentos ágiles y contingenciales para contar con cobertura financiera para enfrentar nuevas emergencias sin arriesgar nuestra estabilidad macrofiscal. Por otro lado, permite fortalecer nuestro sistema de inversiones públicas para avanzar hacia un estándar de mayor resiliencia, gestionando el riesgo de manera integral y por tanto minimizando el impacto que pueden tener futuras catástrofes sobre nuestra infraestructura social y productiva. Este trabajo se logra mediante un trabajo articulado entre múltiples entidades públicas, bajo el liderazgo del Ministerio de Hacienda y con el apoyo de la Secretaría de Comercio e Inversiones. Juntos trabajamos porque El Salvador sea un país más seguro y resiliente, para así garantizar el desarrollo y bienestar de todos los salvadoreños, su cultura y patrimonio. Los programas de recuperación representan una valiosa oportunidad para desarrollar y ejecutar medidas para reducir el riesgo de desastre. La adopción de un marco regulador de la recuperación como paso de preparación para la atención de desastres permite evitar la improvisación, la discrecionalidad y la duplicación o conflicto entre los actores del proceso, desde el Estado a la sociedad. El Salvador tiene una visión clara por el desarrollo, la recuperación económica y sobre todo por el bienestar social. Reconoce que la recuperación debe ser integral y abarcar las dimensiones económicas y sociales, además de la infraestructura para asegurar una recuperación efectiva y resiliente. Finalmente, El Salvador y su presidente, Nayib Bukele, agradecen al sistema de Naciones Unidas y a los firmantes del convenio tripartito por apoyar estos esfuerzos y oportunidades para desarrollar los instrumentos necesarios para atender de forma oportuna y efectiva las necesidades de los salvadoreños. En casos de desastres, bajo principios de reducción del riesgo y de reconstruir mejor. El Salvador un país pequeño que busca un futuro mejor. Y realmente necesitamos contar con el apoyo de todas las naciones para lograrlo. Los salvadoreños estaremos siempre agradecidos, pero también trabajaremos fuerte para lograr un mejor El Salvador cada día. Muchas gracias. Dios nos bendiga a todos.
Bajo el liderazgo del presidente Nayib Bukele, como Ministerio de Hacienda, en mayo del año 2021 aprobamos la Estrategia de Gestión Financiera ante el Riesgo de Desastre, con el objetivo de resguardar la sostenibilidad fiscal del país ante el riesgo de catástrofes climáticas o sanitarias. Esta estrategia desarrolla la generación de conocimiento sobre el posible impacto fiscal ante desastres, la combinación de instrumentos y mecanismos financieros para la movilización oportuna de recursos ante una inminente emergencia, la reducción del riesgo de desastres a través de la inversión pública resiliente y el aumento de la eficiencia, eficacia y transparencia del gasto público en gestión del riesgo de desastres. Con esta herramienta hemos elaborado un plan de implementación que nos oriente en el desarrollo de políticas para gestionar el riesgo fiscal ante desastres y minimizar el impacto de estos eventos en las finanzas públicas, así como la identificación oportuna de mecanismos de financiamiento que nos permitan atender las necesidades derivadas por emergencias climáticas. Actualmente, el país cuenta con mecanismos presupuestarios que han permitido destinar los recursos de forma eficiente y transparente para la atención de necesidades emergentes con financiamiento del Fondo General de la Nación. Además, hemos gestionado mecanismos financieros que brinden resiliencia a las finanzas públicas. En marzo del año 2022, El Salvador suscribió el préstamo contingente para emergencias por desastres naturales y de salud pública con el Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo por un monto de hasta 400 millones. Este financiamiento permite acceder de manera inmediata a fondos para atender a la población. Además, incluye condiciones financieras sumamente concesionales, no genera compromisos de pago ni ingresa al índice de deuda pública mientras no se utilice. El Salvador ahora cuenta con el préstamo contingente más grande de su historia, con el objetivo de mitigar el impacto sobre las finanzas públicas del país ante la ocurrencia de un desastre natural o un evento de salud pública de magnitud severa o catastrófica, con un financiamiento de rápido acceso para cubrir gastos públicos extraordinarios dirigidos a la atención de la población afectada por dichas emergencias. También hemos negociado y aprobado 3 préstamos con el Banco Mundial para proyectos de inversión en las áreas de desarrollo local, salud y educación, en los cuales hemos incorporado un componente contingente de respuesta a emergencias por un valor total de 60 millones, fondos que pueden ser utilizados para la atención de desastres naturales. Por otra parte, esta cartera de Estado se encuentra gestionando la adquisición de un seguro paramétrico para la cobertura por eventos sísmicos, tormentas y huracanes. Hemos avanzado en la incorporación del análisis de riesgo de desastres y la adaptación sostenible al cambio climático como un aspecto fundamental de los procesos de preinversión y formulación de inversión pública. Como Ministerio de Hacienda estamos preparados y continuaremos con la visión del presidente Nayib Bukele, orientada a tener unas finanzas públicas resilientes, además de contar con los instrumentos necesarios para atender de forma oportuna las necesidades de los salvadoreños en casos de desastres y emergencias.
So, thank you very much to El Salvador colleagues, including Secretary Catan and Secretary Posela, and thanks to courtesy of UNDP, we produced this video. So I hope, it was a very enriching experience for me listening to the post-disaster needs assessment experience in El Salvador and how it has contributed towards recovery framework and, recovery planning, investments, and even in DRM. So with this, I think we'll move on to the next presenter, which is Joy Ayun from the World Bank. As I introduced earlier, she will be presenting the Lebanon Rapid Damage and Needs Assessment. So can we have Joy online, please, and start the presentation? Thank you. Yeah, this was, so Joy is going to be joining it. This was after the post-explosion, rapid assessment, and we were, joined by UNDP and EU in supporting the assessment. So, Joy, over to you. And thank you for waking up so early to do this.
No problem. Will you be sharing the presentation, Ayaz, on your end?
Yes, we will be sharing the presentation. Can we put on the presentation, please?
Thank you. So I was saying good morning, everyone, or good afternoon in Bali. Good morning wherever you are, and good afternoon wherever you are. It's a pleasure to be here. Ayaz, thanks for hosting us. We would have liked to be there in person, but it is our world today. So without any further ado, as soon as the slides begin, do you see the slides on your end?
Yes, we see the slides. You will just have to say next, and we will keep moving. Yeah.
Perfect.
You can probably see it on your screen also. Yeah. Please. And sorry, but to rushing you, but we are moving to the closing, so we'll have to be quick. Thank you.
Of course, of course. So last August 4th, 2020, life in Beirut has stopped being what it was up to in many ways. A massive explosion rocked the port of Beirut, killing 20 people and wounding 6,000, displacing around 300,000. So the country's largest port was destroyed together with most of Lebanon's grain reserves. The city's neighboring dense residential and commercial areas were also severely damaged. Lebanon's financial and economic crisis, which had contracted the GDP, resulted in negative credit ratings. So you had a background, if you may, of already simmering crisis, massive public debt, corruption, weak governance, political unrest, and adding to that instability, we were right in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis, obviously, which added a lot of pressure to the health system and to the economy of the country, which also impeded our work. So immediately after the blast, a multi-sectoral team from the World Bank Group, in cooperation with the United Nations and the European Union, launched a rapid damage and needs assessment. And so the team included Lebanese colleagues who worked around the clock, many of whom were actually escaping the rubble of their own houses, living in that vicinity, actually, or in that 5-kilometer radius around the explosion. And
sorry, Joy, to interrupt you. Should we move to the slides?
Yes, we could move to the first slide. Sorry, I thought I was a bit delayed. That's why, because I see myself delayed. Please move to the first slide.
Keep moving on the slides. Yeah.
That's perfect.
Keep telling us when to move quickly, yeah?
Yes, absolutely. So as I said, we were a multi-sectoral team from the World Bank, also working with different groups to actually launch this RDNA. And we're going to play this quick video. Thank you. If we could go to the next slide. So we've utilized different techniques, and the assessment was done in under 9 days, meaning we deployed drone imagery, social media analytics happening at the same time, satellite imagery analysis, anonymized cell phone data. So all of the remote tools that we had been utilizing in other cases over the years, such as Iraq or in Yemen, in addition to Syria, were deployed in order to be able to kick off this rapid damage and needs assessment. We actually had imagery, even and drone imagery coverage of the blast, in addition to that 5-kilometer radius, even prior to the Lebanese government. So we've combined that in addition to, of course, ground surveys. So we've used and utilized this hybrid methodology in order for us to come up with those numbers and to complete the rapid damage and needs assessment. And as you can imagine, I mean, it was COVID-19, which means it was extremely difficult to actually roam around, have those in-person meetings, and do what was necessary. And next slide, please. So we were able to cover approximately 5 social sectors. And as you may have seen the snippet in that video, highlighting one of the mostly hit sectors. We've looked at housing, health, education, culture, social protection. We've looked at transport and port, of course, energy, wash, in addition to municipal services. We've looked at commerce and industry because this was a commercial hub. In addition to a very vibrant business area, and tourism, of course, in addition to governance, social sustainability, and inclusion and environment. And I think that the forte of such assessments is over the years, we've been able to include those softer sectors. Next slide, please. And of course, and I think, again, if we delve deeper into this methodology, and what I was explaining a bit earlier, was that hybrid approach, right? And that verification and corroboration, and that combination of those remote tools that were deployed very rapidly, and the ground surveys. But most importantly, and given the political context in Lebanon, we wanted to erect those Chinese walls, if you may, with the government up to a certain extent, and adopt this whole of Lebanon approach, which means while the assessment was ongoing and those tools were being deployed, we were engaging with many stakeholders and had many meetings at the same time, be it with the civil society, with the UN, with some of the directorate generals within the country, in addition to the private sector, academia, and many organizations. Next slide, please. And as you can see, at least, and as I was explaining, and this map showcases that 4,900 buildings were assessed in literally 48 hours. That's how rapidly we deployed, meaning, and we had at least 500 interviews conducted in 9 days. Do not forget that we were covering many sectors. We had many sector specialists on the ground, in addition to conducting a lot of those meetings remotely with all of the organizations. And as I was explaining earlier, the different stakeholders. Next slide, please. And as you can see here, this was an example or an exhibit of a drone imagery that was taken, and how we were able to assess damages, which we had classified into 3 categories, right? Partially damaged, completely destroyed, or no damage at all, depending on where those buildings and where those businesses and everything else were located. Next slide, please. And one of the fortes of this assessment was actually the anonymized cell phone data, to be able to track the traffic, in addition to the occupancy of those buildings, which was the most important part. Yes, you could have a partially destroyed building, but this does not mean that this facility is not functional. And cell phone data actually gave us those accounts of people still utilizing some of the hospitals, people utilizing some of those clinics. And that helped us sort of also assess the level of damage. Next slide, please.
Joy, sorry to interrupt you, but we'll have to conclude fairly quickly. So you'll have about 3 minutes. Sorry, huh? I hate to rush you with
no
this
worries.
excellent
But
presentation.
I think that the forte again of this assessment was definitely the tools, the methodology, and that combination. But in addition to the consultation and the heavy consultation that happened on the ground and remotely via those meetings with the different stakeholders. Next slide, please. So we'll move very, very quickly. And it was extremely important to be able to, have this sort of inclusion, if you may. And as we discussed earlier, this led to putting together the Reform, Recovery, and Reconstruction Framework for Lebanon, or the 3RF. Next slide, please. And some of its principles, and again, do not forget that this happened with a backdrop of political instability, in addition to many underlying economic issues that rose prior. Next slide, please. And the 3RF definitely had different guiding principles. And as Ayaz and others were explaining, we actually built it on years of experience, and hence the difference in between, working in a post-disaster situation versus, a man-made or a post-man-made disaster, or in a protracted, unstable or conflictual situations, and how we could use some of those same principles, but adapted, of course, to that specific context. We talk about transparency and accountability, about sustainable livelihood, obviously the principles that everyone is familiar with, which is the Build Back Better, which is as well the gender equality, and obviously the conflict sensitivity. Next slide, please. And I have to say, to the Rapid Damage and Needs Assessment report, we had added a chapeau chapter, which talks about those reforms. And then this was complemented by the 3RF that we had put together. We wanted to improve governance and accountability, obviously, improving services and infrastructure, jobs and economic opportunities, given the backdrop we were working on and with, social protection and inclusion, given the multi-sectarian, nature of the country as well. Next slide, please. And of course, a few weeks later, we erected the Lebanon Financing Facility. And this was a way to sort of give donors confidence in a sort of financing facility that would channel those fundings and be able to finance the project. So the LFF has a 5-year horizon to provide and to support, if you may, the priorities that were underlined by the Reform, Recovery, and Reconstruction Framework. The LFF also adopted the strong fiduciary monitoring and oversight, and provides direct support to capable civil society organizations on the ground, meaning the money or the donors' money would be channeled through those organizations and through international organizations as well. And to date, the LFF received contributions and pledges from the governments of Canada, Denmark, France, Germany, Italy, and Norway. So just to explain that those funds are not channeled through the government, but through that financing facility that we had put together. Next slide, please.
Joy, we need to conclude.
We're done, I think. Yeah, let's stop here.
Just offer your final thought on any lesson learned that you have, or we can take it through the questions.
I think we can wait for the Q&A and respond then.
Okay. Thank you so much, Joy. Sorry I kept interrupting you. I'm very sorry for that, but it was an excellent presentation. I think it was an exemplification of all the principles and the hybrid approach that I was talking about earlier. And I had the pleasure of being personally involved in the assessment. So, it was a great experience, and, it has led to many good things. So thank you, Joy. So with that, I'd like to move on to our online speaker colleague, Tom Hookley. And Tom, maybe, the quick question is your general impressions about the subject, of conducting these assessments in complex crises, and, what has your experience been in terms of good practices, the lessons learned, the key challenges, and in the interest of time, if you could just keep it to 5 minutes, please. So Tom, over to you.
Okay, so thank you, Ayaz, and morning, afternoon, everybody. So maybe I just reflect on three things in a few minutes. So first of all, I think as I mentioned at the beginning, one question is how do you make assessments conflict sensitive? And the second thing was how do you actually look at some of the causes of the crisis? And as I mentioned, I tend to spend most of my time working on conflict-related crisis using this recovery and peacebuilding assessment tool. So again, what makes that distinctive as a methodology, say, from the PDNAs, the post-disaster needs assessment? So I would just flag three things. One is the sort of critical point in time at which the government is able to start to address the causes of crisis. And that point in time will be determined by the trajectory of a conflict. It will be determined by political processes in country. So an example being in Nigeria, where after a lot of territory had been lost to Boko Haram, you had elections with a president who aligned politically with governors in the north, there was an opportunity to discuss causes of crisis that might not have been there 6 months before. So timing is critical. The second thing is to understand the causes of crisis with government. So it's probably, in many countries, actually understanding the systemic causes of crisis, it's important that government at all levels agrees on that, because against that, you can prioritize your actions. And the other distinctive things, maybe the two distinctive things, are just the time needed to engage and consult with stakeholders, often across a former political divide. It's going to take a lot of time if you are going to address those causes of crisis. And one of the entry points to a recovery and peacebuilding assessment is a scoping mission. So right at the outset, to understand the context, to understand if this is the right point in time, to understand if this is the right assessment tool to use. So what does that mean? If you relate that to PDNAs, what does this mean in terms of situations where disasters and conflicts converge? And in the same way, therefore, what are the trade-offs you have between different ways of working? So I think the challenge becomes, obviously, you have a disaster, it is unpredicted, and it comes at a point in time and you need to react to that. And the example that Joy just gave was really, absolutely spoke to that. You had an unpredicted event and needed to respond incredibly quickly, and the tripartite mechanism responded remarkably quickly and efficiently. But in terms of responding to conflicts, there isn't the same point in time, and the need to respond is much more guided by the political situation and by the time taken to understand these causes of crisis with government. So the time taken, typically an assessment under an RPBA will take 6 to 7 months. It can take a lot longer. There has to be the point in time to allow government, perhaps at a federal and a regional, provincial level, to come together, to work together, to have dialogue across former political divides. So there is a very, very different timing between an assessment looking at a disaster, an assessment looking at recovery and peace building. So maybe in the interest of time, just a couple of concluding thoughts. So one is the question, is the term hybrid the right term? Or are we actually thinking more about how do we make sure that a PDNA has that level of conflict sensitivity? One of the sort of principles that Joy was showing that's built into the recovery framework in Lebanon. And how do we make sure that, for example, in a recovery and peacebuilding assessment, there is attention to disaster resilience where it is needed? So I think, one question for me would be, is a hybrid actually the right term? Is it actually feasible for something that needs to be rapid and responding to a disaster to be able to look at the longer term causes of crisis, engaging with government, or are they actually two different things? So I think, to me, perhaps it's more a question of looking at different typologies of crisis and understanding how you build in elements of each, rather than perhaps looking at a sort of hybrid methodology per se. I'm going to, and I think Ayaz will be happy with this, I'm going to pause there in the interest of time, because I know you want to leave plenty of time for questions and answers. So I'll pause there, Ayaz.
Thank you so much, Tom, for being surgical as usual, and for sharing your insightful thoughts and reliving your experience on carrying out these complex assessments. I don't know of anyone else better than you on carrying out these assessments. So maybe, you've also raised some insightful questions, and maybe our next panelist, Rita Missel, can address some of these questions, particularly if hybrid is the right word. Rita, as I know, is at the cutting edge of these complex assessments in UNDP, and has done a lot of work on that. So maybe, Rita, the same question that I asked Tom, maybe over to you, and you can add your own answers to Tom's questions. So the basic question is, how do we combine these hybrid, or whatever you want to call it, approaches of RPBA and PDNA together in complex crisis? What have been your, kind of challenges that you have faced, and the kind of good practices and lessons learned? So you press the button. There is a button which is highly very difficult to. So maybe I'll hand over to you, Rita, with some of these questions.
Thanks, Ayaz and Tom and Joy and others for your reflections. Basically, I think I would come at it from a different angle. I don't know if there are any government delegates here, people from the government sitting here. My key question is, when we do an assessment, what is it that you would want from us as international partners to support you with? I want to start with one disclaimer. While assessment is not an end in itself, it's an important, extremely important starting point for planning recovery for the short, medium, and long term. That's one point I want to make. And in that context, your context determines what kind of assessment you would want. So this is the second important point that I want to make. The context very much determines what kind of assessment you need. However, some of us have been pushed into corners to only provide a certain type of assessment tool and methodology in a context, because the government asks for something that they would need immediately in a short term. And over the last 2 days, we've heard about the tyranny of the rush, where things should be done very quickly, and let's wrap up, let's have something, let money be released, and work start. But understanding that recovery is a long-term process which can actually transcend 1 or 2 planning cycles of a government. So if your general planning cycle of a government is about 5 years, a recovery process could go much longer than that. So if you're planning so much for your own development programs in the regular planning cycle, why do you want to rush through the whole recovery planning part of it, or the recovery assessment plan part of it, and go into straight away into recovery implementation? The second point I want to note, we recognize, the third point, we recognize that it is important to understand that in this current world context, we cannot afford the luxury of dealing with one crisis at a time. So we are here where we have the pandemic, we are living through it right now. But as the pandemic happens, we have volcanic eruptions, we have floods, we have cyclones, we have and many other complex interventions happening. In Beirut, while the blast happened, there was a very, very sensitive political situation going on. It was an economic crisis as well. Then came the blast. So we are not doing an assessment in that in a vacuum of one crisis only. We are doing an assessment in a context which we have underlying already tensions, probably a conflict and things like that, and then one event which becomes the flashpoint triggers an assessment, And so what happened is these flashpoints often decides the kind of instruments to use, which is not exactly the correct thing. Because when you think about risks in the long term, you would like to know that everything that we do, whether it is a socio-economic status, it is the well-being of people, whether it is water, access to land, whether it is access to credit, these are factors that build up the risks in the country. And so everything that we do has to address those risks. So if you say Beirut blast, only do an assessment of all the buildings that have been damaged, we are just doing a patch there, right? We are not being able to address what was the original issue as to why the blast was there. It was more a political, why was this go down not regulated? Why were things in there? How did the blast be triggered? Is it a case of governance that we should be looking at? So, you know, but what I would like to propose is that the answer is not trying to give one or this or the other tool. What we would say is, this is what we are talking about right now between the two communities, that is recovery, peace building assessment, and the post-disaster needs assessment community, is how do we look at a context, and perhaps, okay, it is important at this point of time to start with reconstruction of buildings, because that's something that people will need. They will need homes to live in, they will need livelihoods to get back to, they will need schools to go to, so let's have the buildings up. But what is important is to enable children to go to school, to enable women and families and households to be able to get their food in right time, to enable people living with disabilities to be able to access their health care at the right time. So what is the next step in what we are trying to do through the assessment? So we should have a multi-layered approach to the assessment. The first one, which would be doing a rapid damage assessment, but the second layer would be going through to much more detail in understanding what is the needs of people, working together with them, and then, you know, trying to find out, okay, this has been the impact on people's lives and livelihoods. So the second layer will be understanding the human impact. The third layer will be going into much deeper issues of addressing the governance system in the country, addressing social cohesion issues, addressing state and, you know, people's contract with the state, and the other issues that we should go. Because unless we go to that extent, to the last level, we are going to again be always doing this one part where we will be rebuilding a little bit of buildings and construction, and then we are left without addressing the original and core issues that is at risk in that particular country. So that's why we are seeking now more than ever, and I would want this clear message to the government that it is important to think through a little bit about the kind of methodology and tool you're selecting when you do an assessment. You can do right one to start with, but that should not be the end. And, you know, think of it as a process in which you are looking at long-term risks. And then if you want to address those risks, then your assessment also must go into phases and, you know, start with one, but, you know, complete till you have something more well-defined for you to go to the higher level of goals and visions or national development goals that you have in your country. Because we know whether it's a disaster or whether it's a conflict, whether it is any other type of crisis, it disrupts your development trajectory or processes. So with that, I think I'll stop and hand over to you back. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rita. I think you made my job much easier. You have already, in a way, summarized the session and some of my key thoughts, which I'll just repeat at the very end. So thank you very much for your sharing your experiences and your knowledge of this subject. We have time quickly for some questions before we have to close because of the closing ceremony. So we are happy to take some questions from the audience. We'll pass on the mic to you. So please just raise your hand, introduce yourself, and please ask you the question.
Good afternoon. Thank you for. Good afternoon. Thank you for this. I need to stand up. I think they see me. We are 10 people.
It's okay. It's up to you.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the presentation. I just have a question. No, sorry, this is Marco Del Rigo from FAO. I wanted to know your experience or your thoughts about rapid assessment under conflict situation or crisis context of value chain, especially food value chain restoration, like disruption, and as a consequence, restoration. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We'll take a couple more questions.
Thanks.
And then direct to this. Maybe we'll ask all of the speakers to reflect upon it. Kindly introduce yourself.
Ok. Merci, madame. Moi, je suis monsieur Jean Kamwita Wakamwita, délégué de la République démocratique du Congo aux travaux de la 7e session. Je vous remercie de votre présentation claire. Néanmoins, je voudrais savoir que que peuvent faire les pays en situation fragile et particulière, notamment le mien, la République démocratique du Congo, qui est confronté assez souvent à ces situations de catastrophe, parce qu'après évaluation, il doit y avoir des mécanismes à envisager pour pouvoir répondre réellement aux problèmes de catastrophe en vue de la résilience. Bon, en clair, comment mon pays peut-il tirer profit ou bénéficier de l'accompagnement, notamment le financement que donnent les États et certaines parties prenantes pour pouvoir améliorer qualitativement et sensiblement la situation liée aux catastrophes. Merci, madame.
Yes, can I ask because I missed the question. Thank you very much for the question. I think it had also something to do with resilience building and core benefits. So I don't know if someone is able to translate in the question quickly, if possible. We have interpretation services. Can someone translate the question, or maybe we can ask the speaker if he can do that? Sorry for that. Anyone from the room can volunteer. Yeah.
I'm French, but I can try to translate what was said by the representative of the Democratic Republic of Congo, if you don't mind. Sir, do you want me to go ahead? Est-ce que vous voulez que j'essaie de traduire ce que vous avez dit?
Okay.
Please go ahead.
The question was about the fact that the Democratic Republic of Congo is a fragile country, and he was asking how he can benefit from the assessment methodology and tools that the speaker describes. It was the main. I believe. I hope I correct. J'espère que j'ai traduit correctement ce que vous avez dit.
Thank you, sir. So when we get a response from the speakers, we'll ask you to translate the response also for the gentleman. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. All right. So we have other questions. I thought there was someone else. And please also, if you have specific speakers or panelists that you want to pose the question to, otherwise I'll ask them generally to answer. Okay, Rita, let's start with you. Making use of your presence here, and then we'll move to Tom and Joy and see if you have other questions. So, for the first question on the food value chain and the links, over to you, and then maybe Tom can add also.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think FAO is one of the key partners for us in the assessment process, where they contribute in two ways. One is the agriculture sector assessment, which is led by FAO often in the country. And then within the human impact assessment, one of the critical indicators that we look at is food security. Because understanding how food has been affected, or the basket of nutrition that is available has been affected through the crisis, is for us a critical indicator about how the people are coping with the crisis. So as a coping mechanism, we try to measure the availability of nutritious food based on the FAO standards, and try to reflect that within the assessment, in the human impact particularly. And of course, the issue of value chain and its linkages to trade, commerce, and others is addressed within these three core sectors that we are talking about. Agriculture, but agriculture linking to trade, SMEs and MSMEs, which is also reflected across livelihood sectors. So that's how it is usually covered in a typical assessment. But for me, one of the critical issues that we face often is this, while the data for understanding the impact on food security is very strong and easily available because you have such strong monitors on place, how then do you use that data to plan a good recovery to scale up their access to food is something that is quite challenging in the recovery, So what does it mean in terms of translation to that, to the recovery process? I think that is the challenge. It's otherwise your food security monitor and indicator together with yours and WFP makes a huge difference in trying to assess people's access to food and food security.
Yeah, it's just let me add to that quickly. So this is a typical part of the assessments, looking at the impact on food security in particular. And I've been a part of assessments, particularly in Somalia, the drought impact and needs assessment on Dina, where we focus very heavily on food security. So depending on the context and the, fragility on food, the depth of the analysis or the breadth and the breadth of the analysis varies accordingly, but it's an essential part of the methodology, and I'll be happy to share with you later on the drought impact assessment as in Somalia as an example, and there are many other examples. So maybe we can ask maybe ask Tom, and after that Joy to reflect on the questions, particularly on the food value chain, and also Tom, the question was, how do we, and then I will request a translation, how can fragile countries benefit from this kind of support? So I think we have answered that partly, but maybe you can add to that. So let's start with Tom and then move to Joy for the same two questions.
Okay, thanks, Ayaz. So I'm definitely not going to say anything on the value chains, because I think I won't. I think you will know a lot more about that than I do. Just maybe one reflection on assessments in fragile contexts, and again, maybe just to sort of reiterate a little what Rita was saying. So the context is all important. So even though, as Rita was saying, we have these different methodologies, everything has to be adapted to the context. And in that sense, the question is, what will be the starting point? And also, where do you want to end up? But again, maybe just also to give emphasis to a point that Rita made, in that if your starting point, for example, is a catastrophic event, a disaster, that may well be in a fragile context related to structural challenges, maybe related to governance challenges. So actually, I would agree with Rita in the sense that what you want to look ahead is how you do address these structural governance, other issues that will allow you to make sure that the country becomes more resilient and therefore less prone to disasters in the future, and therefore addressing that fragility. So just in summary, the context is absolutely important. Every context is different, and that's why I struggle a little bit with a sort of hybrid methodology, but I very much think that there will be different contexts, different typologies in which an assessment needs to fit.
Thank you, Tom. And Joy, would you like to add anything to that before I ask the gentleman here to translate Tom's response? Yeah, and maybe I'll add a few thoughts of my own, and then we'll conclude. So, Joy?
Yes, thank you, everyone. I was going to translate the good gentleman's French question, but
so go ahead.
We had we had a direct translation from the public. And what I wanted to add here, Tom, and just to bring a small clarification for everyone's benefit, is that when we talk about a hybrid methodology, it is not about the approach per se, it's about the tools utilized. That's what I mean by hybrid, meaning we've utilized remote tools, social media analytics, satellite imagery, anonymized cell phone data, and the Internet of Things, right? But in addition to that, we had ground surveys deployed at the same time, meaning we had that ground truthing element in addition to those remote tools. That's what's meant here by hybrid, and obviously nothing else, literally pertaining to the tools and how was the assessment conducted. I just wanted to clarify that hybrid term or hybrid approach. That's one. Two, obviously I do agree with my colleagues, with Tom, with Rita, with what was brought up whenever we are dealing with specific country contexts. And that's why in Lebanon, there was the whole of people approach, meaning in that sense, trying to divide, that assessment. And in addition to that, the reform, recovery, and reconstruction framework, and then the Lebanon financing facility, and separated from the state structure that was somehow challenged by the people, right? In addition to that I'm sorry, 4 a.m. in DC, losing my words, multi-sectarian backdrop, in addition to the economic crisis, in addition to that break of that social contract. And that's why we had adopted this approach of actually engaging with local stakeholders and with civil society organizations in order to somehow put together the reform, recovery, and reconstruction framework, in addition to the chapeau chapter of that rapid damage and needs assessment that we had conducted. And I think that erecting those Chinese walls, or that seal that we created in between engaging with the government versus actually engaging with the people, this was definitely the novelty of this assessment. And all of this, again, was done, and this engagement was done in a difficult context.
Thank you, Joy.
Just wanted to bring that point.
Thank you so much, Joy. Thank you for enriching the discussion. So, as I said, we offer a lot of support to fragile countries in answer, in response to the question. And, very happy to discuss bilaterally also, how we can support, but we carry out assessments in fragility and conflict settings all the time. And we provide support, so, to the governments directly and indirectly. So maybe you'd like to quickly translate it for the gentleman, and then I'll summarize the overall discussion.
I've asked our colleagues from Democratic Republic of Congo, but the translator made good job. That means I don't need to. This is not my profession, translator, but the translator has done good job apparently. So I don't need to go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay, thank you very much. Then in that case, we don't need that. So, let's bring this to a conclusion here. So I think I'm just not going to spend a lot of time on the summary. I think it's all said by maybe by Rita. Maybe I'm a little biased towards that, but she's highlighted the challenge of speed versus relevance and thoroughness in these assessments. And then, the hybrid approach and what term to be used. I think we got some perspectives from Joy and from Tom, which are not necessarily conflicting, but, maybe talking about the same thing, but in different words. And then, I think we highlighted the need for addressing multiple crises and dealing with approaches that deal with multiple crises at the same time. I think that's the essence of my experience in these situations. I think Rita also talked about addressing the intrinsic risk factors. I think the structural drivers of the conflict or the situation on the ground, and because without that, and she talked about not a one-size-fit-all approach, but trying to contextualize as necessary. That's extremely important, and we need to follow up these assessments. I remember not an output or a deliverable. They're a process, an ongoing process of dialogue and reflection. So we need to continue building upon the analytical framework. We do carry out recovery frameworks after that and other analytical work. So, just last but not the least, I think one of the core principles that all the speakers have highlighted is, when we are carrying out these rapid assessments or damage assessments in fragility, conflict, and violence settings, we need to be addressing, taking cognizance of the core structural drivers of conflict and issues. And there are analytical frameworks now available, which can partly look at that. And, we are happy to discuss that bilaterally with you. But with that, I'd like to, bring the session to a conclusion. I'd like to thank you all for your patience and your interest in the session. I would like to thank all the speakers and panelists for their sharing their insightful experiences. And hopefully some of this will go into, our closing ceremony also, in terms of our resolve to keep supporting you in this effort. So thank you very much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.